Okay, hopefully you watched those screencasts so that you're not behind. So as I mentioned, those screencasts cover the first 39 slides. Basically, I introduce you to the respiratory system. Then we cover the upper respiratory system anatomy and a little bit about function, not a lot, but a little bit about function. And then we move to the lower respiratory system. And it's in that lower respiratory system that I want to start, because now we're going to get into the real physiology of the respiratory system. Okay? All right, so let's start here. Okay, so here are our learning objectives. We're going to describe the location of the lungs, describe the pleura of the lungs, describe the respiratory tree, and then we're going to differentiate between the bronchi and bronchioles. Your primary bronchi enter the lungs at what's called the hilus. So your trachea basically is a tube that connects the larynx to the bronchi, where these bronchi branch from the trachea and they enter the lungs at this depression called a hilus. So now we're in the lungs. The apex of the lungs is basically located, it's the top of the superior part of the lungs. It's basically located right below your clavicles. The base of the lung sits on top of your diaphragm. Your lungs are asymmetrical. On the right side, you've got 3 lobes, the superior, middle, and inferior lobe. On the left, you've got just a superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Your right lung is also larger than your left lung because your heart is slightly left of center. This is a cross-section of the thoracic cavity. You can see here the heart flanked by the right and left lung. And what I want you to see here are the serous membranes that surround the lungs. Now, if you recall, serous membranes are a double membrane. Serous membranes are composed of 2 membranes, and they completely line the ventral body cavity, and they also surround the organs that are in the ventral body cavity. Now, we give them different names depending on where they are found. The serous membranes surrounding the heart we call the pericardial membranes. The serous membranes surrounding the digestive organs we call the peritoneal membranes. The serous membranes that surround the lungs are referred to as pleural membranes. The outer layer is the parietal pleura, and it's shown here in blue, and it lines the thoracic cavity. And then you have the visceral pleura, sort of shown here in red, and the visceral pleura are connected, or are attached rather, to the lung itself, just like the visceral pericardium was attached to the myocardium of the heart. And then between those 2 layers, we have a potential space called the pleural cavity, and that pleural cavity is filled with fluid, which allows, as you inhale and exhale, the 2 layers to glide across one another. They resist being pulled apart, but they glide across one another rather easily. This is a view of those pleural membranes. You can see the magenta one is the visceral one, and the lighter colored one is the one shown here in blue is the parietal pleura. Alrighty, so what you're looking at here is a respiratory tree, and the respiratory tree it's called such because it sort of looks like a tree, upside down tree. You have the trachea, which then subdivide into a primary bronchus, which then divides into a tertiary bronchus, and then finally a tertiary bronchi. Then those tertiary bronchi subdivide to even smaller branches called terminal bronchioles. This little line here sort of represents the division between the bronchi and the bronchioles. Bronchi are large, they're macroscopic, they're composed mainly of cartilage, less smooth muscle. And then the bronchioles are microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye. They have less cartilage and more muscle. Okay, something I just realized as I was going through here is that which I just described, that was actually covered in that second video that I made. So I just sort of negated the whole reason for me putting together that second video. But I do a much better job and I go slower in that video that I posted online. So again, if you didn't watch that video, well, you just got it right there. Okay, now the new material I have that you were not expected to have covered yet. We'll start now. This is the lower respiratory system continuing. Now we're going to take a different point of reference, though, where we're going to start really focusing on function and less on anatomy. I had to introduce you to the anatomy so that you can understand the physiology. So now we're going to start really focusing on physiology. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that you can differentiate between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. We're going to list the components of the conducting zone in order, describe the functions of the conducting zone, list the components of the respiratory zone in order, describe the function of the respiratory zone, and then we're going to describe the respiratory membrane. Okay, so the conducting zone consists of the part of the respiratory system where we're not actually having gas exchange occur between the blood and the respiratory tract. There's no gas exchange occurring in the nasal cavity or your pharynx or your larynx or even the primary or terminal bronchioles. However, they're simply conducting or moving air from the outside to the lungs or from the lungs to the outside. So they're playing a very important role, but gas exchange is not what's occurring. Now, another very important role that the conducting zone plays is it's conditioning that air as it moves from the outside world toward your lungs. We don't want as you breathe, we don't want your lungs to lose too much water and become dehydrated. We don't want them to get too cold. And we also don't want dust particles and microorganisms making it to your lungs, which could cause infections and can interfere with gas exchange. So as air journeys through the conducting zone down to your lungs, it's filtered, it's warmed, and it's also humidified or moistened. So it's conditioned on its way down to the lungs. So the conducting zone plays a very important role, not only in moving air to and from the lungs, but conditioning that air as it makes its way to the lungs. The respiratory zone is the portion of the respiratory tract where there's actually gas exchange occurring between the air in the respiratory system and the blood, specifically the pulmonary capillaries. Coming off of the terminal bronchioles, you have the respiratory bronchioles. That's the beginning of the respiratory zone. They lead to alveolar ducts, which are found in alveolar sacs. And those alveolar sacs are composed of the alveoli. And this is where gas exchange actually occurs between the air in the respiratory tract and the blood. Okay? So gas exchange occurs in the respiratory zone. And that's where we're going to focus our time now. Okay? So let me sort of orient you where you are. So here we have a terminal bronchial. Terminal bronchial is the last segment of the conducting zone. Coming off of the terminal bronchial are the respiratory bronchioles. Those respiratory bronchioles, notice they have air sac alveoli attached to them. And those respiratory bronchioles end blindly into these alveolar sacs. And these alveolar sacs, here's one blowing up, right? They sort of remind me of a bunch of grapes, except, grapes are composed of grape guts, right? These alveolar sacs are open and they're just airspace, right? So here's our alveolar duct. Here's our alveoli. Alveoli are also referred to as air sacs. Notice that most of the alveolar sac is airspace. In fact, even though your lungs take up the majority of your thoracic cavity, they only weigh about 2 pounds. I mean, they weigh less than your heart. And that's because they are mainly composed of open space filled with air. So again, this whole bunch of grapes is called the alveolar sac. It is composed of the alveoli and the end of that respiratory bronchiole, which is the alveolar duct. So gas exchange, that's where oxygen and carbon dioxide move into and out of the blood. That occurs in the alveoli. Now, although not shown here, located outside on the outer surface of the alveoli are pulmonary capillaries. And so there's gas exchange between the blood of the pulmonary capillaries and the air in this alveolus. So now I'm going to play this video, and I can't play it on this computer, so I'm going to, if you bear with me for a second, I am going to switch over to my other computer and play it from there. Okay, how am I getting feedback?
I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Alrighty, so I think this will work. I'm praying this will work. All right, so this is going to illustrate how gas exchange occurs.
Several events, including breathing.
Okay, I've got a problem here. Let me figure this out. Okay, I think, no, that's not going to work. All right, tell you what, let me just narrate this as you watch. I'll just narrate this. Sorry. Okay, so what you're seeing here is, someone breathing. You can see the chest expanding and recoiling, right? And that's what's occurring is the thoracic cavity is expanding and recoiling. And so here you have your respiratory tree. Okay, you see here the alveolar sacs I talked about in the individual alveoli. And this is a cutaway of that of an alveolus. Remember I said that you had the alveolus, the air sac, and what you couldn't see was that all along the outer surface of the alveolus, you had pulmonary capillaries. Now what you're seeing here is inspired air coming in, shown in white, high in oxygen, and then expired air shown in sort of like the purplish, right? And you can see
The
that
video is gone.
as the blood enters. Let me pause this for a second. You can see that as the blood was entering, as the blood was entering, um, as the blood was entering, it was sort of a dull color, and as it was exiting, it was now oxygenated. It was a lighter color. Okay, so we've got gas exchange occurring here as oxygen is diffusing out and oxygen is diffusing into those capillaries. And now you're getting ready to see a cutaway animation. So I'll just pause it for a second. So here's the alveolus here. That's the air sac. And then here's that capillary that is located right out on the outer surface of that alveolus. Okay? This shared membrane here, by the way, is called the respiratory membrane. It's basically composed of the wall of the alveolus and the wall of the pulmonary capillary. And gas exchange is going to occur across here. So let me play this video, and you can see that occurring. So you can see oxygen diffusing in and carbon dioxide diffusing out. So when we talk about gas exchange, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the diffusion of oxygen from the air in the alveolus down its pressure gradient into the pulmonary capillaries, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide down its pressure gradient out of the pulmonary capillaries into the air of the alveolus. Okay, any questions at this time? Any questions at all? Okay, well, we're going to continue on. So this is the image from your book. This is basically like a frontal section of a alveolar sac, right? And then so here what you have is a cross section of a pulmonary capillary that's that is on the outer surface of an alveolus. So this is your respiratory membrane. And if we were to magnify this, what you would see is that respiratory membrane is basically composed of a squamous epithelial cell that makes up the wall of the capillary and a squamous epithelial cell that makes up the wall of the alveolus. If you remember, when we looked at simple squamous epithelial tissue in lab, what were we looking at? We were looking at lung tissue. This has to be a very, very thin membrane in order for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across. And notice they share a common basement membrane, and it is across that very thin layer of tissue that we get the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And again, this is referred to as the respiratory membrane. Sometimes it's referred to as the air-blood barrier, but it's not something that I refer to. Okay, a couple of other things I want to point out also. Your respiratory system is a major route of infection. Think of how many times you've been sick. Usually it's involving either your digestive system or your respiratory system or both. A major source of infection is the respiratory system, right? Because we inhale germs all the time, right? The COVID-19 notwithstanding. So there are white blood cells like macrophages that take up residency in our lungs, and their function is to destroy any microorganisms that make it to our lungs to prevent infection and illness. I'll also point out, although I won't go into any detail at this point, that there are these cells called surfactant secreting cells. They secrete substances that are sort of like soap, and it reduces surface tension so that when we exhale, our lungs don't collapse. And I'll talk about that as we get toward the end of the respiratory system. Okay, let's move on to our next topic, which will be aspects of respiration. So we're going to define respiration, and we're going to list the 4 events of respiration. So the production of energy from the intake of oxygen and the release of carbon dioxide during the oxidation of complex organic compounds, that is what respiration is. Basically taking oxygen and slowly oxidizing or burning, if you will, organic compounds such as glucose or fatty acids. That's literally what occurs in our bodies to produce energy, right? So cells use oxygen to oxidize organic compounds like glucose and fatty acids to produce energy in the form of ATP. That's what cells have. That's the form of energy that cells use, and the byproducts that are carbon dioxide and water, right? Not much unlike burning gasoline or some kind of fuel, right? You have to have oxygen, and the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. It is the function of the respiratory system along with cardiovascular system to supply that oxygen to the cell and to remove that carbon dioxide from the cell to support respiration. This involves 4 events of respiration, which we're going to outline now. All right, so these are the 4 events of respiration. The first, of course, is pulmonary ventilation, or simply breathing. This is just the act of moving air into and out of the lungs. What is the purpose of breathing? Well, it's to refresh the air that's in your air sacs. If you don't continually breathe, what happens is the oxygen levels in your air sacs declines and the carbon dioxide levels in your air sacs increases. And this decreases gas exchange because gas exchange is dependent on a gradient, a partial pressure gradient of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we breathe in order to maintain that gradient. The second event of respiration is external respiration. So after we've gotten sufficient amounts of oxygen into the alveoli, then we've got to get it into the blood. That is what occurs across that respiratory membrane as oxygen moves down this partial pressure gradient into blood and carbon dioxide moves out of blood. This is called external respiration because this is occurring between the blood of the pulmonary capillaries and technically the air that's external to the body. After we oxygenate that blood, then the cardiovascular system then has to transport that blood to the tissues of the body, right? So our pulmonary veins bring it back to the left side of our heart then left ventricle then pumps that blood to the systemic capillaries, and at the systemic capillaries, that's where we have internal respiration. In internal respiration, we have oxygen unloaded to the tissues of the body, and we have carbon dioxide loaded to the blood. Okay, this is called internal respiration because this is gas exchange that is occurring inside the body between the blood of the systemic capillaries and our tissues. Okay, so those are the 4 events of respiration outlined. I am now going to talk in detail about each of these 4 events, starting with pulmonary ventilation. This is probably as far as I'm going to get today. Okay, so we're going to explain completely the process of inhalation and exhalation. We're going to compare lung and pleural space pressures. All right, so I don't remember if you recall this, or even if I said it, to tell the truth, but physiology is a marriage between physics and biology, right? Physiology of respiration simply utilizes 2 basic principles of physics. And if you understand these, then you'll understand pulmonary ventilation. Okay? The purpose of breathing is to maintain a pressure gradient for oxygen and carbon dioxide between the capillaries, the lung capillaries, and the systemic capillaries. The heart circulates the blood by maintaining a pressure gradient throughout the vasculature. All right, so let's look at Boyle's law. I don't know if anybody remembers Boyle's law from high school chemistry, but it basically establishes the relationship between pressure and volume. And as I talk about this, and you know, don't get put off by, oh my God, this is chemistry and I hate chemistry. Okay, this is something simple that you already know, right? You know that as the size of something decreases, the pressure is going to increase, right? If you take a balloon and you start to compress the balloon, what happens? The pressure in that balloon gets greater. So this is something you're already familiar with. But basically, Boyle's law basically says that volume is inversely related to pressure. Let's look at this container here on the left side. Let's say it has a pressure Y and it has a volume X, and the air inside that container is pushing along the sides at pressure Y. What if we collapsed the size of this container and made it so that it was only half its size? Had the same amount of air in it, but it's half its size. Well, that air is now going to be pushing it twice the pressure around on the surfaces of that container. So if we decrease volume to 1/2 X, what's going to happen to pressure? Again, if we decrease the volume, cut it in half, what's going to happen to the pressure at which that air is pushing? If you said it doubles, you are correct, right? Because now we have half the amount of space containing the same amount of air, right? So this is just an illustration that Boyle's law tells us if there's a drop in volume, pressure is going to increase with equal magnitude. All right, and this is a little contraption I found online that just basically sort of illustrates that. As volume decreases, pressure increases, and vice versa. All right, second thing that you have to understand is that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. And a great illustration of that is a vacuum cleaner. Okay, and everybody is familiar with a vacuum cleaner, at least you've seen one, right? You know that vacuum cleaners suck. How do they suck? Well, there's a fan inside that pushes air out a vent, and it creates an area of low pressure. Pressure is lower than ambient pressure or the outside world pressure, and so air simply moves from high pressure to low pressure. So as long as you understand that the relationship between volume and pressure, and that pressure moves from high pressure to low pressure, that's all you need to understand how we breathe. Okay? All right, so let's look at that. So as I said, breathing is a completely mechanical process. It depends on your thoracic cavity changing in size, volume. That leads to changes in pressure, and those changes in pressure leads to airflow either into or out of the lungs. Inspiration is breathing in. Air moves into the lungs from the outside world. Expiration is exhaling, breathing out. Air moves from inside the lungs to the outside world. Let's look at how that happens. Okay? So when you inhale, take a big inhalation right now and just sort of note what happens to your thoracic cavity. So you should have noticed a few things. One, when you exhale, your diaphragm falls and it increases the size of your thoracic cavity. Also, you should have noticed that your your sternum moves anteriorly and your ribs are raised. This increases the volume of your thoracic cavity. As volume increases, what happens to pressure? It decreases. So as as your diaphragm fell and your sternum moved anteriorly and your rib cage was raised, volume increases and then pressure decreases. If pressure in the thoracic cavity decreases, it becomes less than pressure outside the body. And so air simply moves from high pressure to low pressure. And that's what happens when you inhale. You cause a decrease in your, an increase in the volume of your thoracic cavity that lowers pressure, and air just simply moves from high pressure to low pressure. Okay? The muscles that are involved, of course, are the diaphragm, and then you have what are called external intercostal muscles that raise your rib cage. What happens when you exhale, right? Well, the opposite. The diaphragm moves superiorly, your sternum moves posteriorly, and your rib cage falls. This decreases volume, which increases pressure, and then air moves from high pressure to low pressure, and you exhale. Quiet breathing, which is the breathing that you should be doing now, is with quiet breathing, exhaling is a completely passive process. All that happens is your diaphragm and your external intercostal muscles just simply relax. So no energy is involved in quiet expiration. Okay, it is involved in inhalation, but not quiet expiration. Now, if you are actively exhaling, like you're running, when you're and you're breathing heavy, or if you're like blowing air into a balloon, then that's a forced exhalation. And in that case, your internal intercostal muscles pull down on your ribs, and that is energy is being used in that case to exhale. But outside of that, it is generally exhaling is a passive process. So going back to this little contraption, right, this shows what's happening in inhalation and what's happening in exhalation. In inhalation, volume is increasing, pressure is decreasing, and air moves from outside the body where it's high to inside the body where it's low. During exhalation, volume decreases, pressure increases, and air air moves from inside the body to outside the body where pressure is lower. Okay? Alrighty, so I know I went over by a few minutes, but I thought it was necessary to really do a good job of covering the topic. Thank you for your time. We will pick up from here on Friday.